Then I looked up, and there before me was a man with a measuring line in his hand. I asked, "Where are you going?" He answered me, "To measure Jerusalem, to find out how wide and how long it is." While the angel who was speaking to me was leaving, another angel came to meet him and said to him, "Run, tell that young man," and here I have it highlighted, "Jerusalem will be a city without walls because of the great number of people and animals in it. And I myself will be a wall of fire around it, declares the Lord, and I will be its glory within." Now, to gain some perspective on this, first recognize, I'm going to go back a little bit, that what we've been looking at are the these visions that Zechariah is having. So very much like visions that Daniel had. In the case of Daniel, it was primarily dreams, but and then of course he had his direct meeting with Gabriel. But this goes through, and there are these visions, and it is apocalyptic in the sense that much of it's talking about things to come in the end times, but some of it has its fulfillment before that. And so there was a vision of the man among the myrtle trees. There's the next vision of the four horns and the four craftsmen. And you see this in bold here. And now we're looking at, after the four horns and the four craftsmen, a man with a measuring line. And now, with the four horns and the four craftsmen, what he was there speaking about was the fact that those who came against Israel and had subjected it to such devastation would indeed be judged. But then the four craftsmen imply that it would then be rebuilt. Okay, and now we have a man with a measuring line. Well, what do men with measuring lines do? Well, they're preparing to build something. Now, when I was a kid, we had my great grandfather was an engineer. And one of the things at that point that engineers did was they would survey property as they prepared to build. And we had his measuring chain, and the measuring chain was it was these long bars of iron, maybe about 12 inches long, more or less, with an eyelet on each end so that it would link together in a chain. And it was probably about 100-foot chain, so a little heavy, but that's how they would measure. The iron didn't stretch, and so they would use that to measure. And they had other tools as well to measure. You've probably seen surveyors marking the boundary lines of your property or someone else's, and they had similar types of instruments, the optical instruments and the rest. Um, in my great grandfather's day. Now, in these years, these biblical years when Zechariah lived, it would have been some type of a rope, and they would measure it. And, they measured in cubits typically, which was 18 inches, which was the distance from your fingertip to your elbow. So everybody kind of carried a ruler around with them. Now, it varied a little bit from person to person, obviously, but it was important that they be able to measure. And so here Zechariah has this vision, and he knows what the measuring line is, and he sees this angel who looks like a man doing this measuring. And so then a second angel comes and says, "Run, tell that young man, Jerusalem will be a city without walls." Okay, now, that wasn't the case in the ancient world. You remember the walls of Jericho, the walls of Ai, the walls of Bethel, the walls of Jerusalem. Cities had walls. They had walls because that was to enable them to protect themselves. They typically built on high places. It was not until the time of the Romans that you found cities that didn't have walls. And then after the collapse of the Roman Empire, the walls went back up. So if you've traveled in Europe, you've probably seen places where there are city gates. Well, if there's a city gate, that means there was a wall around the city. And those gates came up right over the Roman roads. When Rome was at its peak, you could travel anywhere in the Roman world, all the way to England, and obviously you had to cross some water to get there, but you didn't find walls and gates. You had a freedom of commerce. You had free travel. It was possible because God declared it to be necessary for the gospel to spread over the Roman roads. They were the great technology of that time. There are still Roman roads in use today. It's hard to imagine, but those roads were 20 feet deep. They had a very unique way and incredibly smart way of building the base of the highway. I was just driving in New York a week and a half ago, and on an old concrete road that was part of the Long Island Expressway, and lots of potholes, and the concrete was somewhat buckled. Well, maybe that's 50 years old, maybe. But then you look at the Roman roads, 2 millennia, more than 2 millennia, and they're still usable. Um, and so walls were the standard and the norm for most of mankind throughout most of our history. Today, we generally live without walls. We have borders, although there obviously are many trying to get rid of them. But we don't, by and large, have walls. But the case of Jerusalem is interesting because some of you I know have been to Israel, and I had the incredible blessing of being able to go. And I was surprised when you look at the city of Jerusalem, you can walk around the city in a relatively short period of time. The walls are there, and the city is beautiful. It really is nice. Um, the but in the day in which this was written, okay, so let's think about the context. The walls were down. Okay, this was at the end of the captivity. This was when people were going back from Babylon, and actually, many of them, perhaps 90%, didn't want to go back to Jerusalem. They wanted to stay in Babylon. They were comfortable. They had been living there for 70 years, 2 generations, and they had made their homes there, and they didn't want to go back. In some ways, very similar to what you saw happening with the diaspora, the dispersed Jews prior to World War II. There were Zionists who had begun to settle in the land of Israel, but very few, and they were usually considered to be mildly crazy, maybe not by everybody, but certainly by some. And you had Jews all over the world who had become very comfortable and in a great many cases very wealthy, well established, and they had no desire to move back to Israel. It was only after the war, when the Jews had gone through such struggle and half of the Jewish population of the world had been destroyed, that you saw some Jews flocking to go back to Israel. Well, when Zechariah is writing, you had a similar kind of thing. The people had been taken into captivity. They'd made their homes there. They weren't anxious to go back and rebuild any temple. They had made lives for themselves. It was comfortable. They had fit into Babylonian society. They may have still been worshiping Jehovah, but they were comfortable. And so here, what he's saying is Jerusalem will be a city without walls because of the great number of people and animals there. Well, the angel with the measuring line is measuring for a massive population, but there's almost nobody who is there. In fact, it will be, now this is probably 509 BC, thereabouts. It won't be until 445 that you have Nehemiah coming. And Nehemiah hears how devastating things still are in Jerusalem. The jackals and the wolves wander the streets. The walls are still down. The temple hasn't been fully rebuilt. And it's a wasteland. And Sam Ballard and his friends work hard to keep the handful of Jews that are there, a relatively small number, more than a handful, from rebuilding. Okay, but here is this prophecy given almost two generations before saying Jerusalem is going to be a city without walls, but in a good sense, not a bad sense, not because the walls have fallen down, but because there are going to be such a large number of people and animals in it. And then he says this, and I myself will be a wall of fire around it, declares the Lord, and I will be its glory within. Think of what it took to fulfill this prophecy. Okay, so World War I. First, you needed the Zionists in the 1800s. You needed a few who wanted to go back, Elie Weissman and others. Then, World War I, you wound up with the Balfour Declaration. And so you had that because Elie Weissman was a chemist and he had created a formula that enabled the English and obviously the Allies to win the war with Germany. Because you see, Germany is where the gunpowder was made. Some of you are well aware of this. And England didn't have gunpowder. And it's really tough to fight a war without gunpowder, without explosives. And Elie Weissman created a new type of explosive using acetone, and they called it cordite. And so World War I was fought where the smell of cordite was everywhere on the battlefield. And at the end of the war, the parliament decided they would bless and thank Elie Weissman. And Lord Balfour came up with the idea. I think he's the one who came up with it, but in any event, he was the member of parliament who wound up having the charter to work this out. And there was the Balfour Declaration, which said that the land that had been recovered from the Ottoman Empire, who was an ally of Germany and therefore lost the war when the Germans lost, that area of land that had been the historical Israel would ultimately be given as a homeland to the Jews. So you had a land for the people. Nothing much happened. Parliament actually, I don't think, intended to ever give it to the Jews, but it may have been ceremonial, but ultimately it became a key item because after World War II, you had the people willing to go back. Okay, and so you had something very similar happen here. When you go back to the ancient world, to ancient Israel, first you had a few Jews who left Babylon to go back to the land of Israel, but they really didn't acquire. They didn't accomplish too much. The walls were still down. It was still devastated. It was still a mess. And so some years later, 50, 60 years later, at that point, Nehemiah goes back and they rebuild the walls. And now Israel is getting reestablished. And now once the walls were up, it became a safe area to go to. And many more Jews moved from Babylon down to Israel. And as time went on, more and more and more came. Okay, and so here then is this interesting promise. There's the promise that there will be a city without walls. And he says, and I myself will be the wall. I will be a wall of fire around it, declares the Lord, and I will be its glory within. And he goes farther and he's seeking to entice those who are staying in Babylon. Come, Flee from the land of the north, declares the Lord, for I have scattered you to the four winds of heaven, declares the Lord. Now, at first, it appears that this is applying primarily to Babylon. But when he says this, for I have scattered you to the four winds of heaven, you know that he's actually talking about this future fulfillment, because they hadn't been scattered everywhere. They had just been taken to the Babylonian captivity. Now, if we take a look at Luke, what we see is the destruction of the temple. And Jesus, in response to a question as to, in essence, when will all of these things happen? All of the future things, where in this case, he's talking about the temple being destroyed and not one stone upon another. And then he tells them, okay, there are going to be things that happen. Nation are going to rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. Well, this is the middle of the Pax Romana. Nations aren't rising against nation. There is, in essence, one world government at that point. He says there'll be earthquakes, pestilences, and so on. He says you're going to be persecuted, which happened. And he goes through, he describes a variety of different things. And then we get to this, it's highlighted here. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. That happened in 70 AD. And he advises them to flee the city. Well, it's interesting when he says, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, let those in the city get out, let those in the country not entering the city enter the city. Who's he talking to? He's talking to his apostles. He's talking to his disciples. And the followers of Jesus, the early believers, stayed in the city. They didn't leave, even though in Acts chapter 1, they were told, Judea, Samaria, ultimately the uttermost parts of the earth. Well, not many went. They stayed. They were comfortable. But when they saw the city surrounded by the forces of General Titus and later Emperor Titus, Caesar Titus, they fled, and the gospel spread. And so it was at that time, 70 AD, where Jerusalem was destroyed. Israel was conquered completely and devastated. And it says this, that the Jews will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. That was the diaspora. That was the dispersion spoken of in Zechariah. That happened. I was at the Colosseum 2 weeks ago, and adjacent to the Colosseum, there's the Arch of Constantine and there is the Arch of Titus. And on the Arch of Titus, it was built to celebrate his victory over Jerusalem. And you see depicted in fresco on the side the Jews being taken in chains, and you see Roman troops holding some of the utensils from the temple, like the menorah. And so that is the fulfillment. That was the fulfillment, 70 AD, of the prophecy that was made back in Zechariah. And then this additionally, we'll look more at this later, Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Okay, do you see that? The times of the Gentiles. Elsewhere, the same basic phrase is translated, the full number of the Gentiles have come in. We'll see that in a minute. But let's go back to Zechariah. You see, he scattered them to the four winds. That happened not with the Babylonian captivity, but in 70 AD. But it's the emphasis is to come back to the land. Come, flee from the land of the north. Well, Germany was one of the lands from the north. Russia was one of the lands to the north. In fact, Moscow was due north of Jerusalem. And what we've seen now is Israel has been reestablished, not as it was by the Maccabees. The Maccabees fought off the Seleucid Empire, and Antiochus Epiphanes was the was their ruler at that time. But for years, for decades, actually for centuries, um, the land of Israel had been a political football controlled by one country or another. And then the Maccabees revolted, and for a short period of time, starting I think in about 104 BC, I think to about 37, they were independent, but not particularly powerful, and almost a vassal state in some ways. Um, but then 70 AD, Israel as a nation disappears from the face of the earth. Okay, this section of scripture here in Zechariah deals directly with that. And then he says, "Come, Zion," talking to the Jews, "escape you who live in daughter Babylon." Remember, Mount Zion is there in the center of Jerusalem. Uh, "Escape you who live in daughter Babylon." Well, I believe that that's probably a reference. There's a symbolic use of the word Babylon, not just the physical Babylon, the location, but also the world opposed to God. And then he says, "For this is what the Lord Almighty says, after the glorious one has sent me against the nations that have plundered you." And that was the previous chapter where it talked about the four horns and that God was upset with them because they had so totally devastated Jerusalem, much more than he would have liked. But he says, "He has sent me against the nations that have plundered you." And then he says this, "For whoever touches you touches the apple of his eye." The apple of the eye is the center of the eye. Now, if you were to look at the Middle East and just look at it demographically, they are surrounded by Arabs. And if you colored them, pick whatever color you choose, and then you color Israel with a different color, you see what is in essence an eye. And in the very center, this very tiny nation, and that's Israel. It's amazing when you look at a map. And now, of course, as you look at a map and you begin to include Europe, Europe is moving away from Israel. Europe is embracing Islam. Every mayor of a major city in England is Muslim. There are huge areas in France now that are no-go zones. Sweden too, and excuse me, other places in Europe. The Muslims have come in. They're rapidly outbreeding the native populations, which is how they took over Northern Africa and how they took over significant parts of the Middle East. Turkey was a Christian nation at one point. Constantinople was named after Emperor Constantine. That's 325 AD. It wasn't Muslim. The Muslims got up into half of Spain. The Moors. They were in Italy. They got as far north as Vienna before they were turned back. The people like to present the Crusades as, oh, the Christians went out to plunder and chase after the Muslims. No. It was started the Muslims, and the attacks were the Muslims, and the Crusades were the response. But the sad thing is that whole area, St. Augustine was bishop in Northern Africa because that was all Christian. The world as it is today, we're used to Europe being Christian. If you look at it demographically, it's hard to imagine how 20 years from now it's going to be Christian. And you see already massive problems. Large sections um, are dealing with Sharia law. Some cases in England are judged using Sharia law in the courts. Things are changing. What he is saying, though, here through Zechariah and through this vision is that those who touch Israel are touching the apple of his eye, and that he will judge them. And it says, the glorious one has sent me against the nations that have plundered you. Back in Genesis 12, God speaks to Abraham and says, I will bless those who bless you, I will curse those who curse you, and through you all the nations of the world will be blessed. Okay, well, the fact that people come against Israel, they continue to find exactly the same thing. There is a wall surrounding Israel. The wall is God. Things happen that are inexplicable unless you add God to the equation. This is now some of the fulfillment of what we just read and other sections in prophecy. 1967, 2018, the Jews get back the physical land area of Jerusalem in the Six-Day War. And in 2018, President Trump formally recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And here you see the prophecy. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. That's what we just read in Luke 20:24. Ultimately, the Jews got Jerusalem back. Impossible. Absolutely impossible. They spread throughout the world. In fact, so impossible that the Christian church generally presumed that God's promises that were unfulfilled to the Jews would be fulfilled in the church. And, many of them were. But it was a dual fulfillment. So when the pilgrims came here and the Puritans after them, they viewed this not just as a New England they were coming to, but a new Israel. And you read their writings and you see that they believed that they were the inheritors of the promises made to the Jews, and that this nation was a promised land, just like the land of Canaan. And that just as the land of Canaan had Canaanites in it, we had the native Indians. They had crossed a huge body of water, broader than the Red Sea or the Jordan, to get here. And they saw so many parallels. They believed that this was the ultimate fulfillment and that there would be other fulfillments as well. Okay, so what we saw then is they got the land back. And ultimately, the key thing was Jerusalem now is recognized as a city controlled by and the capital of Israel. Now, the Israeli military, consider this. I'll give just a couple of situations where God was a wall around Israel, and we could look at hundreds of them. And it's interesting because a lot of what I found looking at newspapers.com and Israeli newspapers. Israel was fighting a battle on 4 fronts: Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. What had happened was that the David Ben-Gurion had declared the establishment of this new state of Israel. Within 20 minutes, President Truman had said that he recognized this new state. By the way, Great Britain did not for quite some time after that. And there were a few other smaller countries that chose to recognize this new state. But the king of Saudi Arabia had promised the Arabs who lived in the land of Israel, because we're both Arabs and Jews living there, that if they would leave their land and go into a temporary city, a tent city, basically, in fact, there were several of them, for just a short time, I think he said a week or 2 weeks, he said, we will push the Jews back into the sea. Well, that didn't happen. And some of you are old enough to remember that those tent cities existed for the Arabs until, oh, what, about 25 years ago? Might have been a little bit longer. But they didn't drive the Jews back into the sea. And every nation surrounding them was against them. They were grossly overpowered. And they really had limited ability to get weapons. Nobody was selling them weapons. They had to smuggle some weapons in, but they weren't getting weapons. Um, and so they had very limited armament. And so when you get to the 67 war, you had a similar type of situation. There were 800 Israeli tanks against, sorry, I moved my mouse and everything else moves. Sorry about that. Against 2,424 Arab tanks, 350 Israeli aircraft against 939 Arab aircraft. The Arabs received vast quantities of weapons from Russia and Great Britain. Okay, did you catch that? Great Britain. Israel was under an arms embargo by Russia, the USA, France, and others. Okay, couldn't. Okay, so outnumbered, all fronts, all services. But Israel won in just 6 days. Okay, during the War of 67, Israel destroyed the air force bases of the attacking Arab countries. They gained control of Jerusalem for the first time since 70 AD, and they seized additional territory. Okay, it's crazy. They got a huge amount of territory. They got to Sinai. They had Gaza. One reason was that an Egyptian-born Jew, Eli Cohen, and I love this, was a spy. That's his picture there. He was a spy in Syria from 61 to 67. Everybody thought he was a Muslim. Everybody thought he was an Arab. He developed such close relationships with the Syrian political and military leadership that he became the chief advisor, okay, get this, to the Minister of Defense. And so on a tour of the Golan Heights, okay, so this is northeast, he collected intelligence on the Syrian fortifications there, and he pretended that he was sympathetic for the soldiers who had to be in the hot sun all day. And he said, you know, to protect them from the hot sun, we should plant trees at every position. It'll provide them shade. Well, those trees also marked the location. And the Israel Defense Forces were told, bomb the trees. And that strategy enabled the Jews to capture the Golan Heights in only 2 days. Okay, now that one you can say, okay, well, that's smart. That's just intelligence, the hand of God. But there are so many things that indicated the hand of God in this. The night before the war, Egypt's commander-in-chief gathered his high command for a party at an airbase that was far from the front lines, and they were totally caught by surprise. And it was reported that some of them tried to get into the air in order to join their units, and they couldn't even do it. They were too drunk. 2 weeks before the war, Egypt replaced all of its commanders in Sinai with officers who were totally unfamiliar with the terrain. On the morning of June 5th, Jordanian radar detected the Israeli Air Force taking off. They sent a red alert to Cairo to let Egypt know, but the decoding officer used the wrong day's code. And every day you had a different decoding, like kind of like Captain Midnight's decoder ring. You needed a key, you needed a word, or it could have been another different thing. They used the wrong day's code, and he failed to decipher the information. So the warning never came. Instead, the Israeli Air Force decimated the Egyptian Air Force while it was still on the ground, which was critical to the outcome of the war. And there are a lot of blunders, similar to this warning from Isaiah 19. The Lord has poured into them a spirit of dizziness. They make Egypt stagger in all that she does, as a drunkard staggers around in his vomit. And actually, many of the soldiers were drunk. Now, which is interesting because Muslims are not supposed to drink. But in fact, anybody who's been to the Middle East once you get away from Saudi Arabia or you go into private places, you know that drinking is important. Okay, but there were also angels, the wall of fire. So there was a small Jewish community that was under siege by the Arabs who were determined to wipe them out. Um, but they encountered these huge, strange beings that had flaming swords, and they ran away, scared stiff, as the village rabbi watched them. Yeah, excuse me. An Israeli soldier named Gershon Solomon was badly wounded, and he saw Syrian soldiers moving into his area and shooting wounded Israeli soldiers. So they were about to shoot him when they suddenly fled, dropping their weapons. The Syrian soldiers later reported to UN officers that they saw thousands of angels surrounding the wounded soldier, and that was why they ran away. Now, this was reported in the Israeli Times. Okay, these things happened. Israel National News even reported the miracles. There is no end to the stories that have been documented from the battles. Okay, of the Egyptian tank commander in the Sinai Desert who surrendered to a vastly inferior Israeli force on the second day of the war because a desert mirage made him see hundreds of Israeli tanks where there were no more than a dozen. The Jordanian forces, who welcomed the Israeli tanks under the command of Colonel Uri Ram into Shechem on the third day of the war because faulty communication misled the Arabs into thinking that these were Iraqi tanks coming to reinforce them. The battle for Ammunition Hill on the northern outskirts of Jerusalem, which was captured by an Israeli scout by mistake. Okay, this I love. When he fell into a Jordanian trench in the moonless night at 2 a.m. on Tuesday morning, and he started shooting from the hip. And the fall of Ammunition Hill was the necessary prelude to the capture of the old city 30 hours later. Crazy stuff. Okay, but that's what happened. And you only explain that if you put God into the mix. Now, let me go back to Zechariah. Okay, whoever touches you touches the apple of his eye. I will surely raise my hand against them so that their slaves will plunder them. Then you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me. Shout and be glad, daughter Zion, for I am coming and I will live among you, declares the Lord. Many nations will be joined with the Lord in that day and will become my people. Now, Hosea says, no people will become my people, and my people will become no people. And it is clearly teaching, and you see this throughout the Old Testament, that the Gentiles will become followers of God and followers of the Messiah. And here he says, many nations, and the word translated nations, sometimes they'll translate it Gentile, but many nations, but non-Jews, will be joined with the Lord in that day and will become my people. Well, that's happened. But here it's saying nations as well. And I believe what is happening, and this is speculation. Okay, so this is not the clear teaching of Scripture, but I believe it is the best explanation. I believe that what you're seeing happen is the world is dividing right now. And the United States of America is an extension of Jerusalem. It's an extension of Israel. Half the Jews in the world, or almost half the Jews in the world live in Israel. Almost half the Jews in the world live in America, particularly on the East Coast, but also out on the West Coast. And what we see is there are two nations in the history of the world that were established based on a covenant with God, Israel and the United States of America. Both nations are under attack. Our culture is under attack. And yet, just in the recent past, we have seen at the Charlie Kirk funeral, our leaders proclaiming the gospel and their personal allegiance to Jesus Christ. It was most eloquently presented by Marco Rubio, also J.D. Vance and several others. But I mean, the whole thing is really incredible. What you see happening, we are living in prophetic times. Amazing things are occurring. You could not have imagined Dwight Eisenhower, who I believe was a Christian, standing up in a group, or Truman, or think of any other presidents in this past 100 years. But we saw that. We saw that. And we've seen other things, and the close relationship with Israel and how that is constantly under attack. And of course, Satan rages against Israel. And we see it come out in all types of ways through all types of people. But here we're seeing this prophecy that there will be nations that will be joined to Israel. And that's occurring. Okay. And then he says, I will live among you. You will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me to you. The Lord will inherit Judah as his portion in the Holy Land and will again choose Jerusalem. Be still before the Lord, all mankind, because he has roused himself from his holy dwellings. Now, take a look at Romans chapter 11. Okay, in Romans chapter 11, Paul tells us that God did not reject the Jews. He said, did God reject his people? By no means. He says, I'm an Israelite myself, a descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin. So he's saying there's some Jews who are followers of Jesus, and that's been the way for 2,000 years. Benjamin Disraeli, who was at one point prime minister of Great Britain, was a Jew. There have been so many other Jews who were followers of Jesus over the years, but now we've seen a very dramatic increase. But there was always a remnant. It says God did not reject his people whom he foreknew. Don't you know what scripture said about Elijah, how he appealed to God against Israel? Lord, they've killed your prophets and torn down your altars. I'm the only one left, and they're trying to kill me. And what was God's answer to him? And here he speaks about the remnant. He says, I've reserved for myself 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. And you see this matter of the remnant all the way through. So you have 12 spies go into the land of Canaan. 10 are not part of the remnant. 2 are, Joshua and Caleb. 10 have no faith. Joshua and Caleb have faith and ultimately wind up being blessed and ultimately wind up in the land. And so there has always been a remnant, but now that remnant is expanding. So many on this call have read books or listened to Jonathan Cahn. Jonathan Cahn is a Jewish rabbi who trusts in Jesus, and he preaches across all ethnic lines. He's fantastic, and he's unbelievably accurate. When I read his first book, I said, this is crazy. How can all of this be true? And I researched every single aspect of the book and found, yes, it was absolutely so. The prophecies linked in, and someone like Tom Daschle talking about the collapse of the World Trade Center quoted exactly the scripture that everyone else quoted to claim we're going to rebuild and we're going to rebuild better. And it was a prideful statement. I forget the exact section. Thought it was Isaiah 9, but I don't remember. But it was a statement of pride, basically shaking your fist at God. We're going to rebuild this. People didn't realize that reading it. And just so many different little intricacies, and he tied them all together. And so he was speaking clearly and making it clear that we had an opportunity to turn to God. And what we are seeing right now, May 17th, for example, was set aside as a day of prayer by this government. Well, May 17th was also the day of prayer in 1776 that preceded the establishment of the Declaration of Independence, and ultimately, I believe, was the key precursor to our victory in the American Revolution. And so here we see, so too at the present time there is a remnant chosen by grace. And if by grace, then it cannot be based on works. If it were grace, would no longer be grace. What then? What the people of Israel sought so earnestly, they did not obtain. The elect among them did, but the others were hardened. So do you see, he's saying there's elect amongst the Jews as there are elect amongst the Gentiles. And then he says, did they, that is the Jews, stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? And he says, not at all. No. Don't think that. Don't think the Jews are lost forever. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. Oh, that's an interesting statement. So in other words, they wandered, they sinned, but that gave an opportunity for the Gentiles. But if their transgression means riches for the world, and their loss means riches for the Gentiles, he says, how much greater is it going to be? How much greater are the riches when they are fully included? What is it going to be like when we don't see the distinction between Jew and Gentile? Where those who today are God-fearing Jews, and there are, but they've not trusted Jesus. When they're trusting Jesus, well, we're already starting to see with Jonathan Cahn and with others what that means. It's incredible. And he says, I'm talking to you Gentiles, and as much as I am the apostle to the Gentiles, I take pride in my ministry to you, he's saying, in the hope that I may somehow arouse my own people to envy and save some of them. And ultimately, he concludes this whole section, and he says, I don't want you to be ignorant of this mystery. He believed this with all his heart. Brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Don't think you're better than the Jews, is what he's saying. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. Do you remember that phrase, full number of the Gentiles? Luke chapter 20, that we read, 2024. The Gentiles will trod down Jerusalem until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And so it's the full number of the Gentiles coming in. There is this period of time from 70 AD until recently that is the time of the Gentiles. Now, there's some overflow of that, but what we're beginning to see and have been seeing now for some time, more and more Jews coming to Christ. And it is going to be a flood in the very near future. I don't know if that's a year away or that's 5 years away or 10 years away, but that is going to happen. That's what the scriptures are teaching.